Wind worried the pines around Ethan Cole's cabin, the way a hand worries a scar. Patient, relentless, gentle, until it suddenly wasn't. Cedar Hollow lay 6 miles down the switchbacks, a scatter of warm lights beside a frozen river, selling lattes and lift tickets to anyone who wanted wilderness in a brochure. Up here, the Sawtooth foothills didn't care what you bought. They cared only about fire, shelter, and whether you respected the cold. Ethan did. He'd learned respect in places with sand instead of snow, where the horizon burned and the radio never truly went quiet. Now, he was on leave, 30 days to become a man again, to sleep without waking to phantom alarms. He kept his hair clipped close out of habit. He kept his boots lined by the door because habit was safer than hope. At 35, he carried a calm that looked like peace from a distance and like vigilance up close. The weather report had called for whiteout conditions by midnight. The sky already wore that bruised metallic color that meant trouble. Ethan moved around the cabin with a checklist in his head. Latch the storm shutters, stack split pine under the awning, top off the generator, set the old pickup's chains where he could reach them. His breath came out in short white banners. Snow began as a polite dusting, then thickened into flakes that erased the trail behind his boots. He turned toward the porch, ready to retreat into heat and silence, when something snagged his attention. An absence. A wrong note in the night. No animal calls, no shifting branches. Just a hush that pressed on his ears. Instinct made him stop. He unhooked the flashlight and swept its beam across the tree line. The beam found rock and snow, and then a lump. Ethan stepped off the porch into the drift. The wind rose, turning the world into a tunnel of white. He kept the light low and angled, letting shadows show shape. The lump was buried near the edge of his property, where the trees tightened into a dark stand. He slowed, weight over his feet, the same glide he'd used on midnight raids. The beam found a boot first, black leather, tread packed with ice. Then uniform pants, torn at the knee, and a badge, nameplate heart, flashing in the beam like a plea. The woman lay on her side, cheek pressed to the snow, black hair glued to her forehead. Rope bit into her wrists, bound behind her back with knots that were neat, practiced, cruel. A smear of blood had frozen at her temple. Beside her, angled toward her ribs as if trying to become a shield, lay a golden retriever. Even in the storm, the dog's coat held its warmth, honey gold, crusted at the edges with ice. Tape crossed her muzzle. Her tag read, Maple. Rope laced her legs together. Her eyes were open, glassy with exhaustion, but when the light touched her, she pulled a tremor of sound from deep in her chest, a growl that promised the teeth. Ethan crouched, hands open. "Hey girl, easy, I'm here to help." He lifted his gaze to the tree line, searching for a silhouette. Nothing moved except snow. A sheet of paper was pinned to the trunk above them. Ethan pulled it free. The ink was thick and jagged. She talked. "The mountain will finish the rest." Beneath it sat a mark, 3 interlocking chevrons, like a brand. Ethan felt his stomach drop. This wasn't random violence. It was an unfinished execution, and the storm was the weapon. Her breath barely lifted the snow. Ethan's knife rode at his belt, a habit he never unlearned. He drew it and cut the tape from the golden's muzzle first. Maple's lips trembled, and the growl softened into a rasping whine. Her nose bumped his glove, tasting him in the storm. "Easy," he murmured. "You're safe." He sliced the rope at her legs. Maple tried to rise. Her limbs buckled, but she dragged herself until her shoulder pressed against the woman's ribs. He cut the bindings at the woman's wrists next. Bruises ringed the skin, raw and purple. He found a pulse at her throat, thin, stubborn, and watched her breath mist, pause, then return. Too slow, too shallow. Hypothermia would win if he hesitated. Snow was climbing fast, and he couldn't haul 2 bodies at once. He shrugged off his parka and wrapped it over the woman, tucking the collar beneath her chin. Then he scooped Maple up. She was all muscle under ice-crusted fur, heavier than a pack, and she shivered hard against him as he fought through the drifts. The pickup sat half-rimed in snow near the shed. He laid Maple on a blanket in the back seat and rubbed warmth into her ears until her eyes stayed open. "Stay," he told her, like an order and a promise, and sprinted back. The woman felt light, but fragile, as if her bones might crack. Ethan lifted her carefully and carried her to the truck, keeping her face turned away from the wind. A faint sound left her throat, pain or protest, then vanished. He shut the door on the blizzard, climbed behind the wheel, and turned the key. The engine coughed, caught, and roared. Headlights cut a trembling path up the short drive toward the cabin, where yellow window light waited like a beacon in the dark beyond. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and wet wool. Ethan carried Lena inside, set her on the worn couch by the hearth, then laid Maple on a rug close to the flames. The Golden's tail tapped once, weak but stubborn. Ethan's first aid kit came out fast. He stripped off Lena's soaked jacket, checked her breathing, and found bruising along her jaw and ribs. Her shoulder sat wrong, but he didn't risk resetting it yet. He cleaned the cut at her temple, taped gauze in place, and slid heat packs from his emergency stash beneath her arms and along her groin to protect her core. Maple kept vigil. She pushed herself upright, trembling, eyes locked on Lena like a promise. When Ethan shifted the blankets, she sniffed his hand and allowed it, the smallest consent. Up close he saw she was a working dog, athletic, honey coat dulled by ice, paws scraped raw where she'd fought the rope. He rubbed her chest until her breathing eased, and she let out a tired, grateful huff. The note lay on the table. Ethan read it once more and folded it away because staring wouldn't change what it meant. He tried his phone. No signal. The weather radio spat only static beneath the storm. He locked the deadbolt, dragged the heavy bar across the back door, and set his shotgun within reach. Outside, wind battered the logs and snow scoured the windows. Ethan had come here to find quiet. Instead, quiet had delivered 2 lives into his hands, and a threat into the dark. He listened to Lena's thin breaths and Maple's steady heart, and he made a choice. The mountain would not finish anyone tonight. If their hunters returned, they'd find him awake, the fire fed, and Maple at his side ready to stand. Fire had a way of arguing with winter. Ethan fed the stove with split pine until the flames steadied, then crouched by the couch and watched Lena Hart's chest rise. The blankets he'd piled over her were already damp, where ice melted into wool. Her skin still felt too cold, like river stone. He checked her pulse again, stronger but not safe, and kept the heat packs pressed where they mattered most. Every few minutes he said her name and listened for any change in the thin, stubborn rhythm of her breathing. Maple stayed on the rug, close enough to feel the fire's breath, far enough to keep Ethan in view. The golden retriever's coat steamed as it dried, releasing the sharp scent of snow and pine. Rope burns circled her legs like angry bracelets, and a narrow gouge along her hip oozed sluggishly. When Ethan reached for antiseptic, Maple's ears pinned and a warning rumble rolled up from her ribs. He froze, hand open, letting her decide. "You did your job," he murmured. "Now let me do mine." He set the bottle down, backed away, and sat on the floor with his forearms resting on his knees, eyes lowered. After a long moment, Maple inched forward, nose working, then pressed her forehead briefly against his sleeve, a tired headbutt that felt like permission. He was cleaning the wound with warm water when the knock hit the door. 3 hard thumps that cut through the wind like gunshots. Ethan's body moved before thought. He crossed the room, grabbed the shotgun, and killed the lamp by the window. Another knock, closer, confident. He slid to the side of the door and listened. No drunken shuffle. No lost tourist calling out, just the scrape of snowshoes and a steady breath. Ethan lifted the peephole cover. A woman in a Forest Service parka stood on the porch, hood rimed with white. She pushed it back, revealing a dark braid and a face browned by sun even in winter. Her eyes were sharp and impatient, the kind that didn't waste fear on weather. Kayla Moreno. Ethan had met her once in town. She belonged to the back country. Now she raised her gloved hand, showing her ranger badge in the porch light. Ethan unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door a crack, keeping the chain on. Wind slammed in, carrying needles of snow. "Moreno," he said, "bad night to check cabins." "Road's about to close," she replied, voice clear over the roar. "I'm doing the North Loop, making sure nobody's buried alive." Her gaze flicked past him into the dark cabin. "Ethan, why is your place blacked out?" He hesitated a heartbeat too long. Kayla leaned closer, and her attention snagged on the couch. "Oh my God!" The chain rattled as she pushed. Ethan released it and stepped aside. Kayla moved like someone trained to decide fast. She dropped her pack, knelt by Lena, and found the pulse at her neck with practiced care. Hypothermia, she said, and concussion, maybe ribs. Her gaze swept to Maple. The Golden's head lifted, and Kayla's expression softened for half a second. K9, she whispered. Yeah, Ethan said. Found them bound in the snow. There was a note. Kayla didn't ask for it yet. She pulled out a compact first aid roll, then a second kit marked with a red paw print. I carry vet supplies, she said. We get the dog stable, we keep her warm, we do not move your patient unless we have to. Maple gave a low, uncertain woof when Kayla approached. Kayla stopped at arm's length and let the dog see her hands. Hey, sweetheart, she said softly. I'm Kayla. You're safe. Maple's tail thumped once, cautious. While Ethan held a flashlight and warmed water on the stove, Kayla cleaned Maple's hip wound, shaving a narrow strip of fur with a tiny razor. This is fresh, she murmured. Not deep, but it'll get angry fast. She dabbed on antiseptic, then pressed a thick salve into the cut. My dad's recipe, she added. Works. Kayla shifted back to Lena. She checked the heat packs, adjusted the blankets, then lifted Lena's eyelid with careful fingers. Pupils react, she said. That's good. She poured warm electrolyte drink into a mug and held it near Lena's lips, waiting for the moment she could swallow without choking. That moment came with a small sound. Pain dragged across breath. Lena's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then snapped wide as she tried to sit. Her injured shoulder betrayed her, and she gasped, face twisting. Ethan stepped forward, palms out. Easy, he said. You're inside. You're safe. Where? Her voice was shredded. Her gaze darted to Ethan's broad frame, then to Kayla, then down to her own body wrapped in blankets that weren't hers. Panic flared, hot and sharp. My dog! Maple answered, pushing up on unsteady legs and padding to the couch. She rested her chin on Lena's thigh, eyes shining with fierce relief. Lena's breath broke. She slid her good hand into Maple's fur and held on like it was an anchor. Maple, she whispered, and the word carried a whole story of nights and trust. Kayla kept her tone gentle but firm. Detective, you're going to sip this. Small sips. If you fight the cold, you lose. Lena obeyed, the mug shaking in her hand. After a few swallows, her eyes cleared. The detective in her resurfaced, replacing panic with a hard focus. They took my phone, she said, as if starting a report. They took everything. Ethan retrieved the frozen paper from the table and held it where Lena could see. Her eyes narrowed at the 3 interlocking chevrons. That mark was on a crate at the Marina warehouse, she whispered. I thought it was just a shipping logo. Kayla pulled her handheld radio from her pocket, thumbed the button, and heard only hiss. Storm's jamming repeaters, she said, and if someone's dirty, they'll be listening anyway. Maple gave a soft, warning huff, as if she agreed too. Ethan leaned against the table, keeping his body between her and the window without making it obvious. Who's they? Lena's jaw tightened. A crew that calls themselves the Timberline Serpents, smuggling opioids and unregistered guns through the forest roads. I've been undercover for 7 months. Her gaze flicked to Kayla. If you're a ranger, you've seen the trucks. Kayla's face went still. Closed service roads, heavy rigs at night, and a chemical smell near the old Laurel Fork mine. She swallowed. I reported it. It vanished. Because somebody inside Cedar Hollow PD is feeding them intel, Lena said. They knew my meat spot, my route, everything. Her eyes dropped to Maple's bandaged hip and the rope burns. Anger cracked through her composure. They left us for the storm to finish. Outside, something tapped the window. Ice, branch, or a thrown pebble. Maple's head lifted, ears pricking, a low growl forming. Ethan's grip tightened on the shotgun. Kayla looked toward the dark glass, then back at Ethan. The blizzard had hidden the crime, but it had also hidden the killers. If those men realized Lena Hart was still breathing, they would come back to make sure the mountain kept its promise. By dawn, the blizzard had spent itself, leaving the world sharpened and silent. Pale sun spilled over the sawtooths and turned every drift outside Ethan's windows into glass. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and wet dog, but the air no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a waiting room. Lena Hart sat upright against a stack of pillows, her right arm cradled in a sling Kayla had fashioned from a torn flannel. Color had crept back into her cheeks, though pain kept her mouth tight. Maple lay at her feet, chin on Lena's boot, eyes tracking Ethan's movements with steady devotion. Ethan poured hot water into a thermos, checked the latch on the doors, and listened for anything beyond wind. Nothing. "We go back," Lena said, voice rough but firm, "before the sun softens the snow." Kayla started to object, then caught the stubborn set of Lena's jaw and sighed. "On my route," Ethan replied, already pulling on his coat. He knelt beside Maple, brushing frost from her whiskers. "Can you work?" Maple's tail thumped once, and she stood, favoring her hip but ready. Ethan clipped a leash to her collar, more comfort than control, and rose. They left the pickup at the edge of Ethan's clearing and entered the timber on foot, where the snow lay unbroken except for deer prints and the shallow trench Ethan had carved the night before. Ethan took point, moving with practiced patience, scanning between trunks and rock outcrops. Kayla walked beside Lena, offering her shoulder when the slope steepened, her ranger's eyes reading the terrain like a map. Maple ranged ahead on the leash, nose low, inhaling in short pulls. For her, the forest was layered with yesterday's fear, gun oil, sweat, and the bitter trace of tape. She paused, head tilting, then corrected her course with sudden certainty, tail lifting. The cold bit Lena's lungs, but each time she wavered, Maple returned to press her flank against Lena's shin, lending balance the way she did on patrol. They crested a small rise and the wind dropped away, as if the trees held their breath. Ethan lifted a gloved fist, halting them. Ahead, the snow looked scuffed, a disturbance that didn't belong to animals or weather. Maple's ears pricked, and she pulled them toward the memory of violence. Lena's gaze hardened, and Ethan felt the old mission focus settle in. The ambush site showed itself in small betrayals: a snapped twig, a dark stain beneath skimmed snow, and the shallow body hollow where Lena had been left. She stood over it, jaw clenched, as if the ground still remembered rope and fists. Ethan circled wide, checking for tracks that didn't belong to animals, then knelt and brushed powder aside with a stick. Maple worked in tight arcs, sniffing, ignoring squirrel trails with calm focus. She froze at the base of an aspen and pawed twice, scraping fast. A brass casing winked up through the white. Ethan used tweezers from his kit and dropped it into an evidence bag. 9mm, he said, reading the head stamp. Lena's eyes narrowed. "They police their brass," she murmured. "One left behind means they got rushed." Maple sneezed, then angled toward the pine where the note had been pinned. She dug at a shallow drift, slower now, careful, and gave a soft, pained whine. Ethan followed her nose and found a scrap of black adhesive stuck to a frozen leaf. He lifted it with the tweezers and sealed it in a second bag. Lena nodded once. "Industrial tape," she said. "Same stuff from the crates. Yesterday." Maple followed a scent line Ethan couldn't read, weaving between trunks until she stopped at the pine and dug with urgent focus. Snow sprayed from her paws, and pain made her hips hitch, but she refused to quit. "Easy," Lena rasped, yet Maple kept working, driven by something older than obedience. Her claws struck fabric. Ethan uncovered a strip of burlap, stiff with ice. Edges darkened as if it had been pressed to skin. The moment it hit open air, an acrid odor bloomed. Sharp chemical, bitter metal. Maple recoiled and sneezed hard, tail dropping. Kayla leaned in, then straightened quickly, face tightening. "I've smelled that," she said. "Near Laurel Fork Mine." "We wrote it up as dumping." Lena's eyes went flint. "Cutting agents," she murmured. "Or precursors." Ethan sealed the burlap and scanned the ridge, imagining rifles behind every boulder. The snow preserved their clue, but it also hid anyone watching. Maple returned to Lena's side and pressed her shoulder to Lena's shin, steadying her. For one quiet second, Lena buried her fingers in warm fur, then forced herself upright. "We move," she said, "before this place becomes a trap again." Ethan nodded, and they started back downhill together. They reached the pickup without seeing another soul, yet Ethan still felt watched, the way he had in places where windows blinked. Back at the cabin, he dried the evidence bags and laid them on the table. Casing, tape, burlap. Kayla spread a creased topographical map across the wood, pinning corners with mugs. She traced their route, then shifted to a dotted line curling through the contours. "Old service road," she said. "Closed for years, but trucks can still use it." Her finger slid north to a shaded block. Laurel Fork Mine, vent shaft, side tunnels. Plenty of room to hide drums, crates, even people. Lena leaned in, face tightening as connections snapped together. "If that odor is from precursors," she murmured, "the mine isn't just a waypoint, it's a kitchen." Ethan studied the narrow cuts and ridges, seeing choke points instead of scenery. Maple lay on the rug, exhausted, but kept her head up, eyes following their voices. Kayla tapped a tight curve. "Here," she added, "a bend where headlights vanish, perfect for transfers." Silence settled. They had the where and the how. The who remained a shadow wearing authority. Somewhere in town, someone still counted on their silence. Lena's hands trembled as adrenaline drained, but her mind stayed sharp. "If I submit this," she said, nodding at the bags, "it lands on a supervisor's desk. If the leak is real, it dies there." Kayla traced the map's edge. "State police?" she offered, then hesitated, as if hearing the same doubt in her own voice. Ethan pictured radio traffic, dispatch logs, casual questions that would ripple straight to the wrong ears. He set the folded note beside the evidence. The chevrons looked less like ink and more like a brand. "We don't broadcast," he said. "We gather quietly." Lena met his gaze, gratitude flickering through exhaustion. "The Marina warehouse," she murmured. "If it's active, there'll be tracks, locks, tape. Something I can connect." Kayla nodded. "I can pull land records without raising alarms," she said. "A clerk at the county office owes me a favor." Maple lifted her head at the change in tone, then patted to Lena and placed one warm paw on her boot. A simple, steady pledge. Ethan exhaled and felt the cabin's silence turn into purpose. Tomorrow, they would walk Cedar Hollow like tourists. Tonight, they would fortify, rest, and listen, in case they returned. Morning came brittle and bright, the kind of cold that rang when you stepped outside. Ethan woke to Maple's nose pressed to his hand, warm breath tickling his knuckles. A silent check-in. Lena sat at the table with Kayla's map spread beneath her good elbow, eyes red from pain and stubbornness. "Town," she said, tapping a circle near the riverfront. "The Marina warehouse. If they moved anything during the storm, their tracks will be fresh." Ethan didn't like leaving the cabin, but he liked even less the idea of staying blind. He packed gloves, evidence bags, and the satellite phone, then knelt by Maple. The Golden's bandage was clean, her tail slower than usual. "You guard," he told her softly. Maple's gaze slid to Lena, then back to Ethan, and she gave one deliberate wag, like a pledge. He closed the door on worry and drove downhill into Cedar Hollow. Cedar Hollow had shoveled itself into cheer. Snowbanks glittered along Main Street, and tourists posed by a wooden elk statue as if danger were just scenery. Ethan walked beside Lena with his arms subtly braced under hers, their performance simple. A couple nursing a ski injury. Lena wore a knit hat, pulled low, and oversized sunglasses to hide bruising. Even so, her gaze never stopped measuring exits. They bought 2 coffees at Driftwood Roasters, where a young barista with purple nails chatted about powder days and closed roads. Outside, Ethan let them linger by shop windows until they reached the riverfront. The Marina warehouse squatted beyond the docks, metal siding dull under ice, cameras blinking like cold eyes. A truck idled at a side bay while a man in a gray beanie smoked and watched the street. Lena's fingers tightened on Ethan's sleeve. "That's not a worker," she murmured there. They drifted past the docks, laughing on cue when a family sled flipped, then cut down a plowed service lane that ran behind the warehouse. Ethan pretended to photograph icicles while he studied tires pressed into the new snow, wide, heavy, the kind that didn't belong to fishermen. Lena crouched slowly, hiding a wince, and brushed powder from a tread. "Fresh," she said, "within hours." A padlock hung on the side gate, new brass against old chain, and the same black tape they had bagged yesterday clung to a torn cardboard edge near a dumpster. Ethan didn't touch it. He just let his eyes memorize. The man in the beanie appeared at the corner, cigarette ember glowing. Ethan slid an arm around Lena's shoulders like a tourist cuddle and steered her away, smiling. The man watched them go, then spoke into a phone, his gloved hand covering his mouth as snow fell. Across town, Kayla pushed through the county building's glass doors, stamping snow from her boots. The lobby smelled of old paper and lemon cleaner, and the fluorescent lights made everyone look tired. At the counter sat Walt Bennett, a retiree turned part-time clerk, with a walrus mustache and bifocals perched on his nose. He lit up when he saw Kayla. "Ranger Moreno, you here to yell at me about parking tickets again?" "Not today," she said, flashing a grin. "I need history, land surveys near Laurel Fork." Walt loved history the way some men love fishing. He reeled it in for sport. While he pulled dusty files, Kayla watched two deputies chat near the hallway, their eyes sliding toward her often. Walt returned with a folder and whispered, "Warehouse on the river, owned by a shell outfit in Nevada." He tapped a signature line, "Permit fast-tracked, Captain Derek Mallory himself." Back on the mountain, Maple tried to sleep, but rest kept sliding away. The cabin held safe scents: smoke, wool, Lena's salt, Ethan's soap. And beneath them ran a thin, bitter thread that didn't belong. When the wind shifted, the wrongness sharpened. Maple lifted her head, ears tilting toward the back wall, and rose with a limp. At the barred door, she sniffed the crack, tasting cold air and that trace. She whined once, then padded to the woodshed side, where gusts had scoured the snow thin. Ethan's dog door there was rarely used, but Maple pushed through it anyway, breath puffing hard. She followed the scent to a stack of firewood and began to dig, paws scraping ice and chips until they struck nylon. She clamped her teeth on a strap and hauled a black bag into the open, then sat beside it, eyes fixed on the cabin like a sentry. Dusk found Ethan and Lena back on the mountain road, the pickup's tires crunching over hardpack. Lena's pain had turned her quiet, but every time she glanced at Ethan, he caught something like gratitude hiding behind the detective's glare. When they pulled into the clearing, Maple was on the porch, posture tall despite her limp, the black bag between her paws. Ethan's chest tightened. "Good girl," he breathed, and Maple's tail finally swung, wide and proud. Kayla arrived minutes later, headlights flashing through trees, and hurried inside with her folder. "Mallory," she said, voice flat. "Captain Derek Mallory signed the warehouse permit." Lena went still, as if the name had hit her like cold water. "He recruited me," she whispered. Ethan set the bag on the table and pulled on nitrile gloves. The zipper rasped open. Inside lay a fistful of burner SIM cards and a mud-smeared micro USB drive. Ethan dug an old hardened laptop from a gear case, the kind he kept offline. He cleaned the drive, slid it into the port, and waited while the screen flickered alive. Files populated in a grid, manifests, numbers, encrypted folders. Lena leaned forward, breathing tight, and clicked through what she could read. One folder was labeled Route Ops. Inside were dispatch logs, patrol assignments, and last-minute reroutes that shoved squad cars away from the forest road on nights shipments moved. Kayla's hands rose to her mouth. "That's internal," she whispered. Lena scrolled until she found the authorizations. Each override carried a code, and beneath it a signature line that made her face drain of color. Capt. D. Mallory, badge 302. The cabin seemed to shrink around them. Maple stood, hackles lifting, as if she felt the betrayal in the air. Lena's voice came out small. "He knew where I was." Kayla exhaled shakily and sank onto a chair, the folder slipping from her fingers. Lena stared at the screen, not blinking, as if she could will the letters into a different truth. Ethan closed the laptop and slid it into the case, thinking in layers: distance, concealment, time. "No cell phones," he said. "No calls from town. If Mallory has reach, he'll pull threads." He handed Lena the satellite phone. "Only this, and only when we must." Maple paced once, then returned to Lena, pressing her shoulder into Lena's knee. The detective's hand trembled as it found fur. Outside, the wind shifted and snow tapped the windows. Ethan checked the back door and saw, near the woodshed, a thin line glinting, wire newly set. His blood cooled. He looked at Maple, and Maple looked back, ears forward, as if she'd been waiting for him to notice. "They're close," Ethan murmured. "Tonight." Oh, night fell early, turning the clearing into a bowl of ink. Ethan kept the lamps low and the curtains pinned, letting only the firelight move. The laptop and the black bag sat locked in a cooler by the pantry, wrapped in foil as a rough shield against curious signals. Lena dozed upright, jaw tight, sling across her chest, one boot still touching Maple's flank. Kayla boiled water, set antibiotics for the dog, and listened to the wind like it was speaking. Maple's ears kept tilting toward the woodshed wall, as if something outside paced there, measuring the cabin's dark seams. Ethan stepped to the side window and breathed on the glass to clear a circle. Moonlight bounced off new snow, and for a second he saw nothing but drifts. Then Maple rose, limp forgotten, and pressed her nose to the lower frame. A growl vibrated through her chest. Ethan followed her stare and caught the faintest shine. A filament stretched from the shed corner to a sapling. He did not touch it. He backed away and raised a hand. Kayla froze mid-step. Lena's eyes snapped open, sharp despite exhaustion. "Someone wants us to run," he whispered, and the knight agreed. "They want the back door," Ethan said softly. "That wire is a funnel." He slid the shotgun to Lena, keeping his voice level. "Front window only, finger off unless you see a muzzle." Lena nodded once, professional returning like armor. Kayla gathered bandages and the vet kit, moving to the interior hallway away from glass. Ethan pulled a length of cord and a handful of empty tin cans from a bucket by the stove. He tied them loosely along the porch rail and between two pines, not a trap, just noise. If they crossed, the forest would shout their names. Minutes later, the cans clattered, a sudden metallic hail. Shadows flowed from the tree line. 5, no, 6 figures in winter camo, rifles hugged tight. Ethan killed the fire's draft, letting smoke thin, and moved to the front slit between curtains. A shot cracked, punching into the log wall, spraying splinters across the floor. Lena flinched but held position, cheek to stock, breathing through pain. She fired once, deliberately wide, and the nearest attacker ducked. Maple barked, deep and furious. Kayla kept one hand on the dog's bandage, steadying her trembling heat. Ethan heard boots scrape left, circling toward the shed and wire. He eased the front door open and slipped into the porch shadow, letting the wind swallow him. Snow squeaked under his boots, but the gunfire masked it. He stayed low, using a bank as cover, and watched a man peel toward the woodshed, head down, confident the trap would do its work. The man's glove brushed the trip line. Ethan whispered, "Don't!" though the warning wasn't for him. The attacker hesitated, then stepped wide, searching for another way in. Ethan surged forward, drove his shoulder into the man's ribs, and took him down hard. They rolled in powder, breath steaming. The man clawed for his rifle, but Ethan pinned it with a knee and twisted the arm back until the struggle collapsed into a grunt. Zip ties snapped tight around his wrists. Ethan yanked him upright by the collar. He was young, cheeks raw from cold, eyes wide with panic. Lena's warning shot had bought seconds. Ethan spent them. He dragged the captive through the front door as bullets thudded into logs behind him. Maple met them with a booming bark, planting herself between Lena and the stranger. Outside, the remaining figures paused, then vanished into the trees at last. Silence rushed in after them, thick with smoke and fear. Kayla slammed the bar across the door, checked the tree line once, then turned to the captive with medic hands, looking for bleeding, not sympathy. Ethan sat him in a kitchen chair and looped rope through the rungs, adding zip ties for good measure. The young man swallowed hard, shaking. "CJ," he muttered when Lena asked his name. Lena steadied her breath, shoulders screaming, and kept the shotgun angled low, ready if the attackers came back. Maple stood close, not touching, simply watching. Ethan listened to the timbers, counting each breath. Ethan didn't yell. He didn't pace. He simply stood across from CJ with the calm weight of someone who could end a fight without trying. That calm did more than threats ever could. "You picked the wrong cabin," CJ snapped, then regretted it, eyes flicking to Maple. Lena leaned forward, voice icy. "Captain Mallory sent you?" The name hit like a slap. CJ's bravado cracked and his throat bobbed. Kayla offered him water anyway, setting a mug just beyond his reach. "Talk," she said, quiet. Maple moved closer, nose lifting to CJ's cheek, and huffed at his lie for now. CJ's eyes darted between the 3 adults and the dog that looked like sunlight but felt like judgment. "I'm not important," he said hoarsely. "I just drive. I just watch." Ethan tilted his head. Then watching kept you alive. Use it. Lena's stare never softened. Who runs the serpents? CJ swallowed again. Gideon Cross, he whispered. They call him Cross. Mallory answers to him. Kayla's fingers tightened around the mug. Ethan asked, when's the next move? CJ's shoulders sagged. 2 nights, he said. Laurel Fork. They're meeting trucks there. The words fell like ice. Maple leaned against Lena, warm always. No one in town, Lena said, voice shaking with grief. If Mallory is Cross's gate, the department's poisoned. Ethan nodded, thinking of routes and spots. Kayla looked from the map to Maple's bandage. And the mine is in my district, she said. If this explodes, it's my forest. Lena lifted her chin. I have one person I trust, Federal, Special Agent Noah Hart. She said the name like a rope across a gap. Ethan hesitated, then handed her the satellite phone. Make it short, he warned. Assume we're being searched for. Maple's tail thumped once. Outside, wind shifted under stars. Lena dialed from memory. The satellite phone clicked, then a man answered, sharp. Hart. Noah, Lena said. It's Lena. I'm alive. A beat of stunned silence then. Where are you? Burned, she replied. Mallory's dirty. He's feeding a crew led by Gideon Cross. We have proof and a captive. Ethan watched her keep it tight. We're at a cabin off Forest Road 12. Storm-cut comms. Noah's voice hardened. Do not go to town. Trust no locals. I'm bringing a small federal team, quiet and fast. Send coordinates and stay locked down. Lena exhaled. Please. Maple leaned into her knee. After the call, the cabin felt smaller, every shadow a muzzle. Ethan checked the windows, then the shed line, careful not to brush the wire. Kayla rewrapped Maple's hip and pulled her close to the fire, murmuring praise. Lena faced CJ, knuckles white on the shotgun. Cross will come, CJ blurted, voice cracking. If Mallory thinks the data's here, he'll bring him. Ethan's jaw set. Outside, an engine note drifted up, then vanished. Maple's head lifted, ears spearing the dark. She growled once, low and final. Ethan killed the lamp and raised a finger for silence. The cabin did not sleep, it watched. Ethan kept the fire steady and the curtains pinned, while CJ sat bound to the kitchen chair, breathing in quick, ashamed bursts. Maple lay on her rug, but the fight had stirred her wound. By midnight, her panting turned shallow, her ears too warm beneath Ethan's hand, and a sour heat rose off her honey coat. Kayla checked the bandage and frowned. Fever, she said. If infection sets in, we lose her. Lena's face tightened as she stroked Maple's head with trembling fingers. Town is a trap, she whispered. Mallory will watch every clinic. Ethan studied the satellite phone, the map, and the thin wire glinting outside by the shed. Then we go round town, he said. Kayla, you know someone off-grid. Kayla nodded. Hal Jensen, Fox Ridge Valley, old vet, no questions. Maple lifted her head at Kayla's voice and pressed her nose into Lena's knee, as if begging not to be left behind. Lena leaned close, forehead to fur. You're coming back, she promised. You hear me? Ethan brought out the hardened laptop and the foil-wrapped drive. He and Lena copied the dispatch logs and manifests into a single encrypted bundle, then attached photos of the Chevron note and the evidence bags. Lena typed a short message to Special Agent Noah Hart, stripped down to coordinates and names, and Ethan hit send. The connection blinked green, a tiny bridge over a mountain of silence. Kayla loaded Maple into her truck on blankets, tucked a warm bottle of broth beside her, and drove into the dark, taillights fading between pines like 2 red stars falling. Fox Ridge Valley sat below the ridgeline, where the wind lost some of its teeth, but not its bite. Kayla followed a plowed lane past frozen hay bales to a weathered farmhouse with a small clinic bolted onto the side. The sign, painted by hand, read, Jensen Animal Care. Hal Jensen opened the door before she knocked, as if he'd been waiting for trouble to arrive. He was tall and bent, beard gray, eyes startlingly alive. Ranger Moreno, he said, taking in Maple's glazed stare and the trembling in her legs. That dog's working. She's family, Kayla replied. Hal stepped aside. Inside, the room smelled of iodine and coffee, and a wood stove clicked with heat. Hal's hands were gentle and exact as he shaved fur. flushed the wound, and checked Maple's gums. Maple whined, trying to rise, searching the air for Lena's scent. Kayla held her head and whispered steady nonsense about summer trails and creek water. When the thermometer beeped, Hal exhaled. "Fever, yes," he said, "but not past saving." He hung a small bag of fluids, slipped an antibiotic into the line, and watched Maple's breathing ease. "She'll need rest," he added, wrapping her in a clean quilt. Kayla swallowed hard. "She's the best of us," she said. Hal's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Then act like it," he replied. "Go finish what she started and bring her back to her handler." Back on the mountain, the cabin felt hollow without Maple's steady presence. Ethan kept CJ's hands zip-tied and his ankles looped to a table leg, but he let the young man drink water and eat a granola bar because desperation made people stupid. Lena sat opposite him, bruises shadowing her jaw, her voice controlled. "Cross," she said. "Tell me how he thinks." CJ tried to stare her down and failed. "He thinks everyone sells," he muttered. "If you can't buy them, you scare them." He nodded toward the laptop case. "He'll pay to get that back." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Does he come himself?" CJ swallowed. "Sometimes, if it's big." Lena leaned forward, pain flashing across her face, and kept going anyway. "What's big?" CJ's voice dropped. "Precursors, cash, and people." The last word landed wrong. Ethan went still. CJ stared at the floor. "Not always kids," he rushed, as if it mattered. "But runaways, addicts, anyone Cross can keep quiet. He uses them to carry duffels so nobody shoots." Lena's knuckles whitened on the edge of the table. She looked past CJ as if seeing a line of terrified faces in the dark. Ethan exhaled once, slow. "Then we end it where there's nowhere to hide," he said. They opened the black bag of SIM cards. Ethan kept the phone wrapped in a dish towel, touched only with gloves, not because it was magic, but because it calmed his mind to have rules. CJ provided a driver code word and a nickname for the mine lookout. Lena repeated the details until she could say them without thinking. Together, they wrote a short text that sounded like panic from inside the Serpents, word of a rival crew rolling in from Spokane, and a suggestion to shift the meet to Raven Cut Canyon because the mine was burning. The message was ugly and believable, full of clipped slang and one deliberate misspelling. Ethan sent it, then shut the prepaid phone into a metal pot beside the stove. The silence that followed felt like a held breath before thunder. The satellite phone rang an hour later. Noah Hart's voice came through thin and tense. "I'm staging outside Cedar Hollow," he said. "2 agents, 1 marshal. We move at dusk tomorrow. Your files are solid, but I need Mallory on scene with Cross to keep defense attorneys from turning this into a rumor." Lena's laugh was humorless. "He'll show if he thinks his investment is at risk," she said. Ethan described Raven Cut in plain terms. 1 road in, 1 road out, high ridges that forced headlights forward. No ambush instructions," Noah warned, as if he could hear Ethan's military brain ticking. "You hold, you observe, you protect civilians. My team makes the takedown." Ethan agreed, because agreement costs less than pride. When he hung up, Lena stared at the empty rug by the fire. "Maple should be here," she said softly. Ethan's answer was simple. "She will be. She always comes back." Kayla called just after midnight. The satellite phone buzzed against the table, and Lena grabbed it so fast her sling shifted and she winced. "She's asleep," Kayla said, voice soft with relief. "Hal says the antibiotic is already helping. Maple tried to get up when I said your name, then she sighed like she finally believed you." Lena closed her eyes, breathing through the ache. "Tell her I'm waiting," she whispered. "Tell her she's my girl." Kayla promised and ended the call. Outside, an engine rolled along the forest road, slow, then cut. Ethan moved to the window and watched moonlight tremble on the snowbank. He saw nothing, but he felt the test in the silence. They packed anyway. Ethan sealed the evidence bags, the laptop, and the burner phone, then left the pot lid loose so it would not look staged. Lena pulled on her coat with one arm and tightened her jaw. CJ stared at them, frightened. "If Cross comes, he'll kill me," he said. Ethan nodded once. "Then stay useful," he replied. Before dawn, they stepped into the cold and started toward Raven Cut, because waiting here meant surrender. Raven-Cut Canyon looked like a mouth carved into the mountains, all dark rock and narrowed snowpack, a place where sound traveled farther than it should. Ethan had chosen it for the same reason he'd chosen a cabin in the first place. The terrain forced truth into the open. At dusk, the wind dropped and the cold turned sharp, clean, and listening. Ethan lay prone on a high ledge, rifle braced on his pack. The canyon floor spread beneath him like a white corridor. Below, Lena Hart crouched behind a boulder near the near side bend, sling tight across her chest, pistol steady in her left hand. Every breath tugged pain across her ribs, but her eyes were clear and unblinking. CJ sat 10 yards behind her, zip-tied and hooded for his own protection. Not mercy, because Ethan refused to let a frightened kid become a loose variable. The satellite phone crackled once in Ethan's earbud. "Noah's in position," Kayla's voice whispered, "and I have her." From the shadowed rim behind Lena, Kayla emerged with a bundled shape against her chest. She lowered Maple carefully onto the snow. The golden retriever wore a fresh quilted wrap around her torso, and her shaved patch of fur showed clean stitches beneath. She moved stiffly at first, then lifted her head, caught Lena's scent, and her whole body eased like a knot untying. Maple patted to Lena, pressed her nose to Lena's wrist, and let out a soft, breathy whine. Lena's throat worked. She touched Maple's cheek with 2 fingers, quick and reverent. "Good girl," she mouthed. Maple's tail swished once, then she faced the canyon mouth, posture tightening into work. At the far end, Special Agent Noah Hart and his small team held a blocking line. 2 agents in dark parkas and a U.S. Marshal with a low-profile rifle. Noah's face was set like stone, but when his gaze found Lena across the distance, something fierce and protective flickered and vanished. He keyed his mic. "Lights on my mark, civilian priority." Ethan's reply was a single click. Engines arrived as a vibration before they became sound. 2 trucks rolled into the canyon with headlights dark, tires crunching over frozen gravel. Men spilled out fast, disciplined, rifles up. A third vehicle, an SUV, followed, stopping just behind the lead truck. From it stepped Captain Derek Mallory, shoulders squared in a tactical jacket that looked wrong on him now, like stolen clothing. Beside him walked Gideon Cross, tall and spare, mouth curled in an almost bored line, eyes scanning the ridges with predatory patience. Cross raised a hand and the gunman spread, forming a loose arc. Then the rear doors of the second truck opened and 3 figures climbed down shakily. 2 young adults and a teen boy, faces pale, hands clutching heavy duffels. They were dressed for cold but not for courage. Their fear hung in the air like smoke. Ethan felt something go quiet inside him, the same cold focus he hated and needed. Noah's voice cut in. "Mark!" Floodlights ignited at both ends of the canyon, snapping night into harsh daylight. A loudspeaker boomed, "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" Chaos erupted. Cross's men fired first, muzzle flashes strobing against rock. Bullets sparked high, slapped snow low. Lena stayed behind her boulder, firing controlled shots that pushed one gunman back from the civilians. Ethan tracked the angles, searching for the shot that stopped the worst outcome without starting another. Mallory panicked. He lunged, grabbed the teen boy by the collar, and yanked him tight against his chest. His pistol rose to the boy's temple. "Back off!" Mallory screamed, voice cracking into rage. "I'll do it!" The teen sobbed, duffel dropping into the snow. For a heartbeat, even Cross looked irritated, like Mallory had broken the rules of the game. Noah's team froze, rifles trained but held. Lena's breath hitched, Maple moved. She didn't sprint blindly. She read the moment the way she'd read snow. She slipped out from Kayla's side, low and fast, paws silent on packed drift. A gunman swung toward her, and Ethan's finger tightened, then released. Maple wasn't the target, Mallory was. Maple closed the last yards and slammed her shoulder into Mallory's knees with the full, clean force of a working dog. Mallory stumbled, grip loosening. Maple surged again, not biting the boy, not even snapping. She hooked her jaws into Mallory's sleeve and yanked down and away, a controlled pull trained to break holds. The teen boy fell free and scrambled backward, crying, hands up. Mallory tried to pivot, pistol tracking Maple's head. Ethan fired once. The shot was precise, a hard crack swallowed by canyon walls. Mallory's pistol flew from his hand, skittering across ice. In the same instant, Lena launched from cover despite her shoulder screaming. She hit Mallory's chest, drove him into the snow, and pinned him with her good forearm. The handcuffs came out like an exhale. "You're done!" she hissed, and the cuffs clicked shut with a sound that felt like justice taking shape. Cross saw the collapse and tried to run. Noah's marshal dropped him with a clean tackle, while the agent swarmed the remaining gunmen. One by one, rifles clattered to the ground. The canyon filled with shouted commands, zip ties snapping tight, boots crunching, the ugly end of a long, hidden war. Yet Ethan stayed on the ridge until Noah's voice confirmed, "Secure." Then he rose and walked down, every step thawing something in his chest he hadn't named. Kayla knelt by Maple, hands checking stitches, voice murmuring praise. Maple trembled with adrenaline, then leaned into Kayla's palm. Lena reached them, dropped to one knee, and wrapped her good arm around Maple's neck. "You saved him," she whispered into warm fur. Maple licked her cheek once, salt and smoke and relief. Nearby, the two young adults and the teen boy were wrapped in blankets, given water, guided gently toward Noah's team. CJ, unhooded now, stared at the rescued trio and began to cry silently, shame leaking out of him like heat. Ethan crouched beside him. "You did one right thing," Ethan said. "Keep doing them." CJ nodded, broken but listening. Weeks later, Cedar Hollow smelled like thawing earth instead of gunpowder. In the town hall, Lena stood in a crisp uniform, arm finally free of the sling, bruises faded to ghosts. Noah pinned her badge back onto her chest, jaw tight with pride he didn't try to hide. Kayla, standing at the podium, held blueprints and a grant letter approved with funds seized from Cross's operation, the Cedar Hollow Wildlife and K9 Recovery Center, a place for injured working dogs, rescued wildlife, and the people who needed both. Ethan stayed in the back until Kayla waved him forward. Maple trotted beside him, wearing a new collar with a small silver medal that chimed softly when she moved. The room applauded, but what Ethan felt was quieter than applause. After, the four of them walked up a ridge above town, where snow still lingered in shaded pockets. Maple bounded once, careful but joyful, then returned to sit at Lena's boot, tail sweeping the ground. Lena looked at Ethan. "You came here to disappear," she said. Ethan watched the valley breathe under spring light. "I came here for quiet," he replied. "Turns out quiet isn't found. It's made." Kayla smiled, wind lifting her braid. Noah nodded once, the hardest kind of agreement. Maple leaned into Ethan's leg, warm and solid, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed the mountain could be home.